pen upon that frontispiece, which, after the removal of the gauze paper, had proved to be a little coarse, a little too gaudy. Martin replaced the haze, and through it the colours resumed their mysterious charm. Then on a big transatlantic liner, where everything was clean, polished, and spacious, which had a store selling toilet articles, a picture gallery, and a barber shop, and Wo's passengers danced the two-step and the foxtrot at night on the deck, he thought with rapt nostalgia about the amiable woman with the touchingly hollow chest and the clear eyes, and about the way her fragile frame crunched in his embrace, causing her to say softly, "Ouch, you'll break me." Meanwhile, Africa drew close. The purple strip of Sicily passed by on the northern horizon, and then the purple strip of Sicily passed by on the northern horizon. Then the ship glided between Corsica and Sardinia, and all these patterns of torrid land that existed somewhere around, somewhere near, but passed by unseen, captivated Martin with their disembodied presence. During the night's journey from Marseille to Switzerland, he thought he recognized his beloved lights among the hills, and even though it was no longer a train de luxe, but a plain express, jolty, dark, and grimy with cold dust, the magic was strong as ever, those lights whose wails in the night, whom from Lausanne they drove by car to the chalet, situated about 1,000 meters higher in the mountains, and Martin, who was sitting beside the chauffeur, every now and then would look back smiling at his mother and uncle, who both wore large motoring goggles, and both held their hands in their laps, clasped the same way. Henry Edelweiss had remained a bachelor, wore a bushy mustache, and a certain intonations of his, the way of fiddling with a toothpick or nail file, reminded Martin of his father. On greeting Sophia at the Lausanne station, Uncle Henry broke into tears, covering his face with his hand, but later in the restaurant he calmed down, and in his somewhat pompous French began talking about Russia and his trips there in the past. "How fortunate," said to Sophia, "how very fortunate that your parents did not have to live to see that terrible revolution. I remember perfectly the old princess with her white hair. How fond she was of poor Serge." At the recollection of his cousin, azure tears again welled in Henry's eyes. "Yes, my mother was fond of him, it's true," said Sophia, "but then she was fond of everybody and everything. But tell me, how do you find Martin?" she hastily continued, trying to take Henry's mind off melancholy subjects, which, in his soft mustached mouth, took on a shade of unbearable sentimentality. Yes, he looks like him," nodded Henry. "The same forehead, the same fine—" "But hasn't he grown up?" quickly interrupted Sophia. "And you know he has already been in love, passionately." Uncle Henry passed on to political matters. "That revolution," he asked rhetorically, "how long can it last? Yes, nobody knows. Poor beautiful Russia is perishing. Perhaps the firm hand of a dictator will put an end to the excesses of many beautiful things, your lands, your devastated lands, your country mansion, burned down by the rascally mob. To all that you can bid adieu." "But how much does a pair of skis cost here?" asked Martin. "I don't know," replied Uncle Henry with a sigh. "I have never indulged in that English sport. By the way, you speak French with a British accent. That is bad. We'll have to change all that." "He's forgotten a lot," Sophia interceded for her son. "The last few years, Madame Planche no longer gave him lessons." "Dead," said Uncle Henry, feeling. "One more death." No, smiled Sophia. "Whatever gave you that idea? She married a Finn, and is living peacefully in Viborg." "In any case, this is all very sad," said Uncle Henry. "I wanted so much for Sergei to come here with you one day, but one never obtains what one longs for, and God alone knows what is to come. And you have assuaged your hunger, and I'm sure you don't want anything more. We can start." The road was brightly sunlit and had many turns. A wall of rock with thorny bushes blooming in its cracks rose on the right, while on the left there was a precipice and a valley with water and crescents of foam ran down over the ledges, and came dark conifers clustering in close ranks, now on one side, now on the other. Mountains loomed all around, imperceptibly changing position. They were greenish with streaks of snow. Grayer ones looked out from behind their shoulders, and far beyond there were giants of an opaque violet whiteness, and these never moved, and the sky above them seemed faded in comparison with the bright blue patches between the tops of the black firs under which the car passed. Suddenly, with a sensation still new to him, Martin remembered the dense fir fringe in their park in Russia, as seen through a lozenge of blue glass on the veranda. And when, stretching his slightly vibrating legs and feeling a transparent humming in his head, he got out of the car, he was struck by the fresh, rough smell of earth and melting snow, and by the rustic beauty of his uncle's house. It stood by itself half a kilometre from its nearest hamlet, and the top balcony offered one of the marvellous views that are even frightening in their airy perfection. The same Russian vernal blue sky looked down to the window of the neat little WC with its odour of wood and rosin. All around in the garden, with its bare black plait bands and white apple bloom, and in the fir forest right behind the orchard, and on the dirt road leading to the village, there was a cool, happy silence, a silence that knew something, and Martin felt a little dizzy, perhaps from the silence, perhaps from the smells, and perhaps from the news-found blissful immobility after the 3-hour drive. In this chalet, Martin lived until late fall. It was presumed that he would enter the University of Geneva that very winter. However, after a lively exchange of letters with friends in England, Sophia sent him to Cambridge. Uncle Henry did not immediately reconcile himself to this. He disliked the English, who he considered a cold, perfidious nation. On the other hand, he thought the expenses the famous university required not only did not sadden him, but on the contrary was tempting. Fond as he was of economizing on trifles, clenching a penny in his left hand, he willingly wrote large checks with one right, especially with the expense of an honorable one. Sometimes, rather touchingly, he would feign eccentric pig-headedness, slapping the table with his palm, puffing on his mustache, and shouting, "If I do it because it gives me pleasure." With a sigh, Sophia would slip the bracelet watch from Geneva on her wrist, while moist-eyed Henry would dig at his pocket for a voluminous handkerchief, trumpet once or twice, then smooth his mustache to the right and to the left. With the onset of summer, the cross-marked sheep were herded higher into the mountains. A babbling, metallic tinkling of unknown origin and from an unknown direction would gradually become audible. Floating nearer, it envelops the listener, giving him an odd tickling sensation in the mouth. Then, in a cloud of dust, came flowing a gray, curly, tightly packed mass of sheep rubbing against each other, and the moist, hollow tinkle of the bells, which delighted all of one's senses, mounted, swelled so mysteriously that the dust itself seemed to be ringing as it billowed above the moving backs of the sheep. From time to time, one of them would get separated from the rest and trot past, whereupon a shaggy dog would drive it back into the flock, and behind, gently treading, walking the shepherd. Then the tintinnabulation would change timbre and once more grow hollower and softer, but for a long time it would hang in the air together with the dust. "Nice, nice," murmured Martin to himself, hearing the tinkle out into the end, and continued on his favorite walk, which began a country lane and forest trails. The fir grove abruptly thinned out, lush green meadows appeared, and the stony path sloped down between the hawthorn hedges. Occasionally a cow with wet pink nose would stop on its way in front of him, twitch its tail with a lurch, and the head move on. Behind the cow came a spry little old woman with a stick who glanced malevolently at Martin. Further down, surrounded by poplars and maples, stood a large white hotel, whose owner was a distant relative of Henry Edelweiss. In the course of that summer, Martin grew still sturdier, and his shoulders broadened, and his voice acquired an even, deep tone. At the same time, he was in a state of inner confusion, and feelings he did not quite understand were evoked by such things as the country coolness of the rooms, so keenly perceptible after the outdoor heat, a fat bumblebee knocking against the ceiling with a chagrined droning, the pulse of the fir trees against the blue of the sky, or the firm brown bullet found at the edge of the forest. The imminent journey to England excited and gladdened him. His memory of Alla Chernisov had reached its ultimate perfection, and he would say to himself that he had not sufficiently appreciated the happy days in Greece. The thirst he had quenched, only to intensify it, so tormented him during that alpine summer that at night he could not go to sleep for a long time, imagining, among numerous adventures, all the girls awaiting him in the dawning cities, and occasionally he would repeat aloud some feminine name, Isabella, Nina, Margarita, a name still cold and untenanted, a vacant, echoing house whose mistress was slow to take up her residence, and he would try to guess which of these names would suddenly come alive, becoming so alive and familiar that he would never again be able to pronounce it as mysteriously as now. In the mornings, Marie, the niece of the old chambermaid, would come to help with the household chores. She was 17, very quiet and comely, with cheeks of a dark pink hue, and yellow pigtails tightly wound around her head. Sometimes, when Martin would be in the garden, she would throw open her upstairs window, shake out her dust-cloth, and remain motionless, gazing perhaps at the bright clouds, at their oval shadows gliding among the mountain slopes, then pass the back of her hand across her temple, and slowly turn away. Martin would go up to the bedrooms, determined from the draughts where the cleaning was going on, and would find Marie kneeling in meditation amidst the gloss of the wet floorboards. He would see her from behind with her black wool stockings and her green polka-dot dress. She never looked at Martin except once, and what an event it was! When passing by with an empty pail, she smiled uncertainly, tenderly, not at him, though, but at the chicks. He resolutely vowed to start a conversation with her and give her a furtive hug. Once, however, after she had left, Sophia sniffed the air, made a face, and hurriedly opened all the windows, and Martin was filled with dismay and aversion toward Marie, and only very gradually, in the course of her subsequent appearances in the distance, framed in a casement or glimpsed through the foliage near the well, he began again to succumb to that enchantment, only now he was afraid to come closer. Thus something happy and languorous lured him from afar. but was not addressed to him. Once, when he had scrambled up far into the mountainside, he squatted on a big round-browed rock, and below a herd passed along the winding trail with a melodious, melancholy jingling, and behind it a grey, ragged shepherd and a smiling girl who was knitting a stocking as she walked. They went by without a glance at Martin, as if he were incorporeal, and he watched them for a long time without breaking a step. The man of his arm around the companion's shoulders. From her nape you could tell that she was knitting on and on as they walked into another valley, or else bare-armed young ladies in white frocks, yelling and chasing off the horseflies with their rackets, would appear in the tennis court in front of the hotel, but as soon as they started playing, how clumsy and helpless they became, particularly since Martin himself was an excellent player, beating sheds any young Argentine from the hotel. But at an early age he had assimilated the concord essential for the enjoyment of all the properties of the sphere, a coordination of all the elements participating in the stroke dealt with the white ball, so that the momentum began with an arching swing, still continues after the loud twang of taut strings, passing as it does through the muscles of the arm all the way to the shoulder, as if closing the smooth circle out of which, just as smoothly, the next one is born. One hot August day, Bob Kitson, a professional from Nice, turned up at the court and invited Martin to play. Martin felt that familiar stupid tremor, the vengeance of too vivid an imagination. Nevertheless, he started well, now volleying at the net, now driving powerfully from the baseline to the first corner. Spectators gathered from around the court, and this pleased him. His face was aflame. He felt a maddening thirst. Serving, crashing down on the bell, and transforming at once the incline of his body to a dash netward, Martin was about to win the set, but the professional, lanky, cool-headed youth with glasses, whose game until then had resembled a lazy stroll, suddenly came awake with 5 lightning shots even at the score. Martin began to feel weary and worried. He had the sun in his eyes. His shirt kept coming out from under his belt. If his opponent took this point, it was the end of it. Kitson hit a lob from an uncomfortable corner position, and Martin, retreating in a kind of cakewalk, got ready to smash the ball. As he brought down his racket, he had a fleeting vision of defeat and the malicious rejoicing of his habitual partners. Alas, the ball plumped limply into the net. Bad luck, said Kitson jauntily, and Martin grinned back, heroically controlling his disappointment. 11. On the way home, he mentally replayed every shot, transforming defeat into victory, and then shaking his head. Very hard it was to capture happiness. Brooks burbled, concealed along the foliage. Blue butterflies fluttered up from damp spots in the road. Birds bustled in the bushes. Everything was depressingly sunny and carefree. The evening after dinner they sat as usual in the drawing-room. The door to the piazza was wide open, and since there had been a power failure, candles burned in the chandeliers. From time to time their flame would slant, their black shadows reach out from under the armchairs. Martin picked his nose as he read a small volume of Mospanot with an old-fashioned illustration. Mustachioed bel ami and a stand-up collar was shown undressing with a lady's maid's skill, a copy, broad-hipped woman. Uncle Henry laid down his newspaper and arms akimbo, considered the cards that Sophia was laying out on a green-glazed table. The warm black night pressed in through the window and door. Suddenly Martin raised his head and hearkened as if there were a large beckoning in his harmony of night and candle flame. The last time this patience came out was in Russia, said Sophia. In general it comes out very seldom. Spreading her fingers, she collected the cards scattered about the table and began shuffling them anew. Uncle Henry sighed. Tired of reading, Martin stretched and went out on the terrace. It was very dark out, and the air smelled of dampness and night-blooming flowers. A star fell, as so often annoyingly happens. It fell not quite in his field of vision, but off to the side, so that his eye caught only the twinge of a soundless change in the sky. The outlines of the mountains were indistinct here and there. In the folds of the darkness, dots of light scintillated in twos and threes. Travel, said Martin softly, and he repeated the word for a long time until he had squeezed all meaning out of it, and upon which he set aside the long silky skin it had shed, and the next moment the word had returned to life. Star, mist, velvet, travelvet. He would articulate carefully, and marvel every time how tenuously the sense endures in the sound. In what a remote spot this young man arrived, in what far lands he had already seen, and what was he doing here at night in the mountains, and why was everything in the world so strange, so thrillful? Thrillful, Martin repeated aloud, like he liked the word. Another star went tumbling. He fixed his eyes on the sky, as once upon a time they were driving home in the Victoria from a neighbor's estate along a dark forest road. A very small Martin, rocking on the brink of a slumber, would throw back his head and watch the heavenly river between the amassments of trees among which he was floating, where again his life he wondered would gaze, as then as now, at the night sky, on what pier, at what station, in what town square. A feeling of opulent solitude, which he often experienced amid crowds, the delight he took in saying to himself, "Not one of these people going about their business knows who I am, where I am from, what I am thinking about right now." This feeling was indispensable to complete happiness, and Martin, in a breathless trance, imagined how completely alone in a strange city, say London, he would roam at night along unfamiliar streets. He saw the black hansom crabs splashing through the fog, a policeman in a shiny black cape, lights on the Thames, and other images out of English novels. He had left his luggage at the station, was walking past innumerable illumined English shops, excitedly looking for Isabel, Nina, Margaret, someone whose names he could give to that night. And she, who would she think he was? An artist, a sailor, a gentleman, burglar? She would not accept his money. She would be tender, and in the morning she would not want to let him go. How foggy the streets were, though, and how crowded, and how difficult the search. And although there was much that looked different, the hansoms were mostly extinct. He nevertheless recognized certain things when one autumn evening he walked baggageless out of Victoria Station. He recognized the dark greasy hair, the bobby's wet oilskin cape, the reflections, the swashy sounds. At the station he had taken an excellent shower in a cheerful, clean cubicle, dried himself with a warm, fluffy towel brought in by the ruddy-cheeked attendant, put on clean linen and his best suit, and checked both his bags, and now he was proud that he had managed to so sensibly. He hardly felt fatigued by his journey. There was only buoyant excitement. His huge brushes fiercely, heavily splattered the pools on the asphalt, lighted advertisements went running up dark red facades and dissipated again. He would pass girls, he would often look, but the prettier the face, the harder it was to take the plunge. Inviting cafes such as Athens or Lausanne did not exist here, and in the pub where he drank a glass of beer he found only men, inflamed, morose, with red veins on the whites of their prominent eyes. Little by little a vague sense of irritation overcame him. Surely the Russian family which, by epistolary agreement, he was to stay for a week, was right then waiting for him, worrying. Should he quickly take a taxi and forget about that imaginary night? But his lack of faith in it struck him as shameful. How intensely he had longed for it in that morning at dawn, looking out of the train window at the plains, the cold pink sky, the black silhouette of the windmill. Cowardliness and betrayal, Martin said softly. He noticed that he was walking along the same street for the second time. Recognizing it by a shop window filled with pearl necklaces, he stopped and made a cursory check of his long-standing aversion for pearls. Oysters, hemorrhoids with a sickly sheen. A girl under an umbrella stopped beside him. Martin glanced out of the corner of his eye. Slender figure, black suit, glittering hatpin. She turned her face toward him, smiled, and pursing her lips made a small ooh sound. In her eyes Martin saw the sparkling lights, the play of reflected colors, the shimmer of rain, and hoarsely muttered, "Good evening." As soon as they were in the dark of the taxicab, he embraced her, frenzied by the feel of her supple slenderness. She covered her face with her hands, giggling. Later in the hotel room, when he awkwardly extracted his billfold, she said, "No, if you want, take me tomorrow to a fancy restaurant." She asked where he came from, whether he was French, and at his behest started guessing. Belgian? Danish? Dutch? She did not believe him when he said he was Russian. Later he hinted that he lived by gambling on ocean liners, told her of his travels, embellishing a little bit here, adding something there, and as he described a Napoli he had never seen, he gazed lovingly at her bare childish shoulders and blonde bob, felt completely happy. Early next morning, as he slept, she dressed quickly and left, stealing 10 pounds from his billfold. Morning after the orgy, thought Martin with a smile, slapping shut the billfold which he had picked up from the floor. He doused himself from the pitcher, splashing water all over the place, and kept smiling as he thought the blissful night. It was something of a pity that she had left so foolishly that he would never meet her again. Her name was Bess. When he was out of the hotel and started walking the spacious morning streets, he felt like jumping and singing with joy, and to give release to his spirits, climbed a ladder leaning against the lamp-post. As a result, had a long comical argument with an elderly passer-by, who from below gestured threateningly with his cane. 12. A second scolding came from Olga Zilanov. The day before, the lady had waited for him late into the night, and since she assumed for some reason that he was younger and more helpless than he actually turned out to be, she grew increasingly worried. He explained that on the previous day he had misplaced the address, had found it too late in his seldom-visited pocket, and spent the night at a hotel near the station. Miss Zilanov wanted to know why he had not telephoned in which hotel. Martin invented a good uncommon name, Goodnight Hotel, explaining that he had looked for her number in the book but had not found it. "Shame on you," said Miss Zilanov crossly, and suddenly smiled a marvelous, beautiful smile that completely figured her flabby, melancholy face. Martin remembered that smile from St. Petersburg days, and as he had been a child then, as women usually smile when addressing strange children, his memory had retained a radiant-faced image of Miss Zilanov, and he had at first been perplexed to find her so old and gloomy. Her husband, who had been a well-known public figure in Russia, happened to be out of town, and Martin was lodged in his study. The study and the dining room were on the first floor, the parlor on the second, and the bedrooms on the third. The whole quiet residential street consisted of such narrow houses, undistinguishable from each other, with an identical vertical configuration of rooms inside. A dash of color was contributed by a plump red little pillar at the corner. behind the right row of houses were gardens with rhododendrons bloomed in the summer, and behind the left row a small park containing tall elms and a grass tennis court was growing yellow and bare of leaves. Zelenov's elder daughter, Nellie, had recently married a Russian army officer who had arrived in England after captivity in Germany. Sonia, the younger daughter, was about to finish a London preparatory school to which she had transferred from the Stoyan Gymnasium in St. Petersburg. There was also Miss Zelenov's sister Elena and her daughter Irina, a poor, hideous, half-witted creature. The week he had spent in that house while getting used to England seemed rather tiresome to him, the whole livelong day. He was among strangers and could not take one step alone. Sonia needled him, making fun of his wardrobe, shirts with starched cuffs and stiffish fronts, his favorite bright purple socks, his orange-yellow knobby-capped shoes bought in Athens. These are American, said Martin with studied calm. The Americans make them specially to sell to Negroes and Russians, glibly replied Sonia. Furthermore, it turned out that Martin had not brought a dressing gown with him, and when in the mornings he would go to the bathroom, proudly wrapped in bedclothes, Sonia would say that this reminded her of her cousins and their chums at the Lyceum school, who when visiting the Zelenovs' country house slept naked, walking around in the morning draped in bedsheets, and relieved themselves in the garden. In the end, Martin made so many purchases in London that £10 was not enough, and he had to write to his uncle, which was particularly unpleasant because of the hazy explanations necessitated by the disappearance of other £10. Yes, it was a hard, unfortunate week. Even his English accent, on which Martin quietly prided himself, proved to be an occasion for derisive corrections on Sonia's part. Thus Martin quite unexpectedly found himself classified as ignorant adolescent and a mama's boy. He felt this was unfair, and that he had infinitely more experiences and adventures than a 16-year-old maiden. It was therefore with a certain malicious glee that he drubbed some young men of hers at tennis, and on his last night had a chance to show that he could dance with impeccable two-step, which he had learned back in the Mediterranean days to Hawaiian whales from the photograph. At Cambridge he felt still more foreign. Upon talking to his English fellow students he noted with wonder his unmistakably Russian essence. From his semi-English childhood he retained only such things as had been relegated by native Englishmen of his age who had read the same books as children into the dimness of the past properly allotted to nursery things, while Martin's life at a certain point had made an abrupt turn and take a different course, and for this very reason his childhood surroundings and habits had assumed a certain fairy-tale flavor. When a book he had been fond of in those days was now more enchanting and vivid in his memory than the same book in the memory of his English coevals. He remembered various expressions that 10 years ago had been current among English schoolboys, but now were considered either vulgar or ridiculously old-fashioned. Plum pudding, blazing with a blue flame, was served in St. Petersburg not only at Christmas as in England, but any day of the year, and in the opinion of many people, the Edelweiss chef made a better one than could be bought in his store. Petersburgers played soccer in hard ground, not on turf, and the penalty kick was called pendel, a term unknown in England. No longer would Martin dare wear the colors of the striped jersey bought once long ago at Drew's, the English shop on the Nevsky, for they corresponded to the athletic uniform of the public school he never attended. In truth, all this Englishness, really of a rather haphazard nature, was filtered through his motherland's quiddity and suffused with peculiar Russian tints. 13. The splendid autumn he had just seen in Switzerland somehow kept lingering in the background of his first Cambridge impressions. In the mornings a delicate haze would enshroud the Alps. A broken cluster of rowan berries lay in the middle of the road, whose ruts were filmed with mica-like ice. Despite the absence of wind, the bright yellow birch leafage thinned out with every passing day, and the turquoise sky gazed through it with pensive gaiety. The luxuriant ferns grew reddish. Iridescent shreds of spider-web, which Uncle Henry called the virgin's hair, floated about. Martin would look up, thinking that he heard the remote blare of the migrating cranes, but no cranes were to be seen. He used to wander around a great deal as if searching for something. He rode the dilapidated bicycle belonging to one of the menials along the rustling paths, while his mother, seated on a bench beneath a maple, pensively pierced the damp crimson leaves on the brown ground with the point of her walking stick. Such wild varied beauty did not exist in England, where nature had a tame greenhouse quality, and an unimaginative autumn faded away in geometrical gardens under a drizzly sky, but the pinkish gray walls, the rectangular lawns frosted with pale silver on the rare sunny mornings, the narrow river and the stone bridge, whose arch formed a full circle with its perfect reflection, all had a beauty of their own. Neither were the foul weather, nor the icy chill of the bedroom, where tradition forbade heating, could alter the meditative joie de vivre characteristic of Martin. He grew sincerely fond of this little living room, with its comfortable fireplace, its dusty pianola, innocuous lithographs on the walls, low wicker armchairs, and the cheap china bric-a-brac of the shelves. When late at night the sacred flame of the fireplace threatened to die, he would scrape the embers together, pile some wood chips on them, heap on the mountain of coal, fan the fire with the asthmatic bellows, and make the chimney draw, spreading an ample sheet of the Times across the mouth of the hearth. The taut sheet would grow warm and transparent, and the lines of print, mingling with the lines showing through from the reverse side, looked like the bizarre lettering of some mumbo-jumbo language. Then, as the hum of tumult of fire increased, a fox-red darkening spot would appear on the paper and suddenly burst through. The whole sheet, now aflame, would be instantly sucked in and sent flying up, and a belated passer-by, a gowned dawn, could observe through the gloom of the Gothic night a fiery-haired witch emerge from the chimney into the starry sky. Next day Martin would pay a fine. Being of lively and sociable temperament, Martin did not remain alone for long. Fairly soon he made friends with his downstairs neighbor Darwin, as well as with various men at the soccer field, the club, the dining hall. He noticed that everyone felt it his duty to discuss Russia with him, and learned what he thought about the revolution, the intervention, Lenin and Trotsky, while some who had visited Russia praised Russian hospitality and asked if he happened to know Mr. Ivanov and Moscow. Such talk nauseated Martin. Casually taking a volume of Pushkin from his desk, he would read aloud Autumn and Archibald Moon's translation. O dismal period, visual enchantment, sweetest to me thy farewell loveliness. I love the sumptuous withering of nature, the woods arrayed in gold and purple dress. This caused some astonishment, and only Darwin, a large sleepy-looking Englishman in a canary-yellow jumper, who sprawled in an armchair, making wheezing sounds with his pipe and gazing up at the ceiling, would nod approvingly. This Darwin, who often dropped in after dinner, elucidated certain strict primordial rules in full detail for Martin's edification. A student must not walk outdoors in hat and overcoat, no matter how cold it was. One did not shake hands or wish good morning, but greeted an acquaintance one happened to meet, even if it were Adam Thompson himself, with a grin and a breezy interjection. It was bad form to go out in the river in an ordinary rowboat. For this purpose there were punts and canoes. One should never repeat the old college witticisms, of which Crushman became immediately enamored. Remember, though, Darwin added wisely, that even in observing these traditions you mustn't overdo, for sometimes, to shock the snobs, it's a good thing to go out in a bowler hat, and with an umbrella under your arm. Martin got the impression that Darwin had already been at the university a long time, several years, and he felt sorry for him, as he did for any homebody. Darwin amazed him by his sleepiness, the sluggishness of his movements, a certain comfortableness about his whole being. Trying to stir his envy, Martin impetuously told him about his wanderings, and unconsciously throwing in some of what he had invented for Bess's benefit, barely noticing how the fiction had consolidated. True, these exaggerations were innocent enough. The 2 or 3 picnics on the Crimean plateau turned into a habitual roaming of the steppes with a stick and a knapsack. Alla Chernistov became a mysterious companion of yacht cruises, his walks with her a prolonged sojourn of one of the Greek islands, and the purplish outline of Sicily, actual gardens and villas. Darwin would nod approvingly as he gazed at the ceiling. His eyes were pale bluish, vacant, and expressionless, the souls that he always exhibited, fond as he was of semi-reclining poses, with his feet lodged in some high, comfortable position, were equipped with a complicated system of rubber strips. Everything about him, from those shoddily shod feet to his bony nose, was high quality, large, and imperturbable. 14. About 3 times a month Martin was summoned by this tutor. That is the professor in charge of keeping an eye on lecture attendance, visiting the sick student, giving permission for trips in London, and making reprimands when one was fined for getting home after midnight or not wearing the academic gown in the evening. He was a wizened, pigeon-toed, keen-eyed little old man, and a Latinist, translator of Horace, and a great oyster fancier. Your English has been improving, he once said to Martin. That is good. Have you got to know many people? Oh, yes, answered Martin. Are you friends with Darwin, for instance? Oh, yes, Martin repeated. I'm glad. He is a splendid specimen. 3 years in the trenches, France and Mesopotamia, the Victoria Cross, and not a scratch. Either morally or physically, literary success might have gone to his head, but that didn't happen either. Besides the facts that Darwin had interpreted his college students at 18 to enlist, had recently published a collection of short stories which connoisseurs were raving about, Martin learned that he was a boxing blue, and that he had spent his childhood in Madeira and Hawaii, and his father was a famous admiral. Martin's own meager experience seemed insignificant, pathetic, and he felt ashamed about certain yarns he had spun. When Darwin slouched into his room that evening, the situation seemed both humorous and embarrassing to Martin. Little by little he began to fish for information about Mesopotamia and his short stories, and Darwin kept giving facetious answers, saying that the best book he had ever written was a little manual for students entitled A Complete Description of 67 Ways of Getting Inside Trinity College After Closing the Gates, with a detailed plan of its walls and railings, first and last edition verified many times by the author who has never been caught. but Martin insisted on what was interesting and important to him. The collection of short stories and connoisseurs were raving about, and last Darwin said, "All right, I give you a copy. Let's go to my digs." He had furnished his digs himself according to his taste. There were supernaturally comfortable leather armchairs in which the body would melt as it sank into a yielding abyss. On the mantelpiece stood a large photograph depicting a dog lying in complete molitude on her side and plump behind of her 6 sucklings in a row. Martin had already seen numerous students' rooms. There were those like his, peasant but not pampered by the lodger, containing extraneous objects belonging to the landlord. There was the athlete's room with silver trophies on a shelf and a broken oar on the wall. There was the den littered with books and dusted with cigarette ash. Finally, there was one of the nastiest abodes you could discover, nearly bare with bright yellow wallpaper, a room where there was only one picture. But that one a Cézanne charcoal doodle vaguely resembling a female form, and where a 14th century bishop of colored wood stood proffering a stump of his forearm. The most cordial digs of all were Darwin's, especially if you looked carefully at the brownest bit. What a gem, for example, that set of newspaper issues Darwin had edited in the trenches. The paper was cheerful, jaunty, full of Johnny jingles. Heaven only knows how and where the type was set, and it used chance cliches to beautify blanks. Corset advertisements found in the ruins of some printing plant. "Here," said Darwin, producing a book, "take it." The book proved to be remarkable. The pieces were not really short stories. No, they were rather more like tractates, 20 tractates of equal length. The first was called Corkscrews, and contained 1,000 interesting things about corkscrews, their history, beauty, and virtues. Another was on parrots, a third on playing cards, a fourth on infernal machines, a fifth on reflections in water, and there was one on trains, and in it Martin found everything he loved: the telegraph poles cutting short the wires, upward steep, the dining car with those bottles of Vicky or Evian that seemed to scan through the window of the trees flying past, and those crazy-eyed waiters, and that minuscule kitchen, where swaying and sweating a white-capped man cook would be seen crumbling a fish. If Martin had ever thought of becoming a writer and been tormented by a writer's covetousness, so akin to the fear of death, by that constant state of anxiety compelling one to affix indelibly this or that evanescent trifle, perhaps these dissertations on minutiae that were deeply familiar to him might have aroused in him a pang of envy and the desire to write the same thing still better. Instead, such warm good will toward Darwin overwhelmed him that his eyes even began to trickle. And the next morning, when on the way to his lecture he overtook his friend at the corner, he said with perfect decorum, and not looking him in the face, that he liked the book, and silently walked beside him, falling in with Darwin's indolent but swingy step. The lecture halls were scattered about the whole town. If one lecture immediately followed another but was given in a different hall, you had to hop on your bicycle, or else scuttle along the black alleys and cross the echoing stone of courts. Limpid chimes called back and forth from tower to tower. The din of motors, the crepitation of wheels, and the tinkle of bicycle bells filled the narrow streets. During the lecture, the glittering swarm of bicycles clustered at the gates, awaiting their owners. The black-gowned lecturer would mount the platform with a thump and put his tasseled square cap on the lectern. 15. When he entered the university, it took Martin a long time to decide on a field of study. There were so many, and all were fascinating. He procrastinated on their outskirts, finding everywhere the same magical spring of vital elixir. He was excited by the viaduct suspended over the alpine precipice, by steel come to life, and by the divine exactitude of calculation. He understood that impressionable archaeologist who, after having cleared the path to as yet unknown tombs and treasures, knocked on the door before entering, and once inside, fainted with emotion. Beauty dwells in the light and stillness of laboratories. Like an expert diver gliding through the water with open eyes, the biologist gazes with relaxed eyelids into the microscope's depths, and his neck and forehead slowly begin to flush, and tearing himself away from the eyepiece, he says, "That settles everything." Human thought, flying on the trapezes of the star-filled universe, with mathematics stretched beneath, was like an acrobat working with a net, but suddenly noticing that in reality there was no net, and Martin envied those who attained that vertigo, and with a new calculation overcame their fear. Predicting an element or creating a theory, discovering a mountain chain or naming a new animal were all equally enticing. In the study of history, Martin liked what he could imagine clearly, and therefore he was fond of Carlyle. With his poor memory for dates and scorn for generalizations, he avidly sought out what was alive and human, what belonged to that class of astonishing details which well may satiate coming generations as they watch old drizzly films of our day. He vividly visualized the shivering white day, the simplicity of the black guillotine, and the clumsy tussle of the scaffold, where the executioners roughly handle a bare-shouldered fat man, while in a crowd a good-natured citoyen raises by the elbows a citoyenne whose curiosity exceeds her stature. There were other vaguer fields, such as the mists of law, government, economics. What scared him away from them was the scintilla he saw in everything was too deeply buried there. Undecided what to undertake, what to select, Martin gradually rejected all that might take a too exclusive hold over him. Still to be considered was literature. Here, too, Martin found intimations of bliss. How thrilling was that humdrum exchange about weather and sport between Horace and Maecenas, and the grief of old Lear, uttering the mannered names of his daughter's whippets that barked at him. Just as in Russian version of the New Testament, Martin enjoyed coming across green grass or indigo chiton. In literature, he sought not the general sense, but the unexpected sunlit clearings where you can stretch until your joints crunch and remain entranced. He read a very great deal, but it was mostly rereading, and he did not have occasional accidents in the course of literary conversation. For example, he once confused Plutarch with Petrarch, and once called Calderon a Scottish poet. Not every writer was able to stir him. He remained unmoved when on his uncle's advice he read Lamartine, or when his uncle himself declaimed Le Lac with a sob at his voice, shaking his head and adding with helpless emotion, Comme c'est beau. The prospect of studying wordy, watery works and their influence on other wordy, watery works did not attract him. At this rate, he probably never would have made a choice, and some mysterious voice had not kept whispering that he must not free to choose, that there was one thing he must study. During the sumptuous Swiss autumn, he felt for the first time that he was, after all, in exile, doomed to live far from home. That word exile had a delicious sound. Martin considered the blackness of his coniferous night, sensed a Byronic pallor in his cheeks, and saw himself in a cloak. This cloak he donned at Cambridge, albeit it was only a light-weight academic gown of bluish fabric, semi-transparent when held up to the light, with many pleats on the shoulders and with wing-like half-sleeves that were worn through the back. The bliss of spiritual solitude and the excitement of travel took on a new significance. It was as if Martin had found the right key to all that vague, tender, and fierce feelings that besieged him. At that time the chair of Russian literature and history was occupied by the distinguished scholar Archibald Moon. He had lived fairly long in Russia and had been everywhere, met everyone, seen everything there. Now pale and dark-haired, with a pince-nez on his thin nose, he could be observed riding by, sitting perfectly upright, at a bicycle with hand polish, or at Bizner in the renowned hall with oaken tables and huge stained-glass windows. He would jerk his head from side to side like a bird and crumple bread extremely fast between his long fingers. They said only things in English loved, and the word was Russia. Many people could not understand why he was not remained there. Moon's reply to questions of that kind would invariably be, "Ask Robertson, the Orientalist. Why not ask Babylon?" The perfectly reasonable objection would be raised that Babylon no longer existed. Moon would nod with a sly, silent smile. He saw in Bolshevist insurrection a certain clear-cut finality, when he willingly allowed that by and by, after the primitive phases, some civilization might develop in the Soviet Union. He nevertheless maintained that Russia was concluded and unrepeatable, and that you could embrace it like a splendid amphora, but put it behind glass. The clay kitchen pot now being baked there had nothing in common with it. The Civil War seemed too absurd to him. One side fighting for the ghost of the past, the other for the ghost of the future, and meanwhile Archibald Moon quietly had stolen Russia and locked it up in his study. He admired its finality. It was colored by the blue of waters and the transparent porphyry of Pushkin's poetry. For nearly 2 years now he had been working on an English-language history of Russia, and he hoped to squeeze it all into one plump volume. An obvious motto, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Ultra-thin paper, a soft Morocco binding. The task was a difficult one. To find a harmony between erudition and tight, picturesque prose, to give a perfect image of one orbicular millennium. Archibald Moon amazed and captivated Martin. His slow Russian speech, from which it had taken him years of patience to weed out the last vestige of English vulgarity, was smooth, simple, and expressive. His knowledge was distinguished by freshness, precision, and depth. He would read aloud from Russian poets whose very names Martin did not know. Holding down the page with long, slightly trembling fingers, Archibald Moon poured out iambic tetrameters. The room was in penumbra, and the lamplight pricked out only the page and Moon's face, with a pale gloss on the cheekbones, fine creases on the forehead, and translucent pink ears. When he had finished, he would compress his thin lips, take off his pince nez as carefully as if it were a dragonfly, and clean the lenses with a chamois cloth. Martin sat on the edge of the armchair with a square black cap on his knees. "For heaven's sake, take off your gown and put that cap away somewhere," Moon would say with a pained frown. "Don't tell me you enjoy fussing with that tassel. Away with it." He would push a glass cigarette box with a college blazon on its silver lid toward Martin, or from a cabinet in the wall, produce a bottle of whiskey, a soda siphon, and 2 glasses. "By the way, do you know what a grape transporting cart is called there?" he asked with a toss of his head, and having ascertained that Martin did not, went on with his gusto. Majora, sir," and it was not clear which gave him greater pleasure, that he knew the Crimea better than did Martin, or that he could pronounce the word sir according to its Russian pronunciation, which rhymes it with air. He joyfully informed Martin that the Russian hooligan came from the name of gang of Irish robbers, and that Golodai Island was named not after Golod, hunger, but for an Englishman named Holiday, who built a factory there. Once, when speaking of some ignorant journalist whom Moon had wrathfully taken to task in the Times, Martin said that the journalist had not replied because he probably Strifil had flunked. Moon raised his eyebrows, consulted a dictionary, and asked Martin if by chance he had ever lived in the Volga region. On another occasion, when Martin used the colloquialism Ugrobil bumped off, Moon grew angry and shouted such a word did not exist in Russian. "I've heard it, everybody knows it," Martin said meekly, and was sustained by Sonia, who was sitting on the couch next to Miss Zeleanov and watching not without curiosity Martin playing the host. "Russian world-building, the birth of neologisms," said Moon, suddenly turning to the smiling Darwin, "ended together with Russia, that is 2 years ago. Everything subsequent is Bloknaya Muzhika, thieves' lingo." "I don't understand Russian. Please translate," replied Darwin. "Yes, we keep drifting into it," said Miss Zeleanov. "That's not nice. English, please, everybody." Meanwhile, Martin lifted a metal dome from above the muffins and crumpets which the waiter had brought from the college canteen, checked whether they had sent the right thing, and moved the platter closer to the flaming hearth. In addition to Darwin and Moon, he admitted a Russian student whom everyone called simply by his first name, Vadim, and now Martin did not know whether to wait for him or go ahead with tea. This was the first time that mother and daughter Zeleanov had come to visit him, and he was in constant fear of derision from Sonia. She wore a navy blue suit and sturdy little brown shoes with long tongues that passed beneath the laces and then folded back on the top, covering them and ending at leathern lappets. Her broad, black, somewhat coarse-looking hair fell in an even fringe over her forehead. The dimples of her pale cheeks went singularly well with the dull, dark, slightly slanting eyes. That morning when Martin had met her and Miss Zeleanov at the station, and afterward when he was showing them the ancient courts, the fountains, the avenues of gigantic bare trees, out of which flew cawing the heavy and awkward crows, Sonia had looked moody and cross and said she was cold. As she gazed over a stone parapet at the Ripley Cam and its matte green banks and the great towers beyond, she suddenly narrowed her eyes and inquired of Martin if he were planning to join General Udinek's anti-Bolshevist forces in the north. Martin answered with surprise that he was not. "And what's that pinkish house over there?" "That's the library building," Martin explained. A few minutes later, as he walked under an arcade beside Sonia and her mother, he said enigmatically, "One side is fighting for the ghost of the past, and the other for the ghost of the future." "Yes, exactly," said Miss Zeleanov, chimed in. "This contrast keeps me from really appreciating Cambridge. I'm bothered by the fact that alongside all these marvelous old buildings, there are so many cars, bicycles, sporting goods, stores, footballs." "They used to play football in Shakespeare's time, too," said Sonia. "What bothers me," she added, "is the platitudes of some people spout." "Sonia, behave yourself, please," said her mother. "Oh, I don't mean you," said Sonia with a sigh. They walked on in silence. "I think it's beginning to drizzle-drozzle," said Martin, stretching out his palm. "Why not say Jupiter Pluvius, or Lord Rainsport?" observed Sonia sarcastically, and changed step to match her mother's. Later, as lunch at the town's best restaurant, she cheered up. The simian name of Martin's friend amused her, and she liked Darwin's dialogue with the unbelievably cozy old waiter. "What are you studying?" her mother asked politely. "I, nothing," replied Darwin, raising his head. "I just thought this fish had one more bone than it was supposed to." No, I meant your studies, the lectures you attend." "Sorry I misunderstood you," said Darwin, "but your question catches me unawares all the same. Somehow my memory does not stretch from one lecture to the next. Only this morning I asked myself what the deuce I was reading. Mnemonics? Hardly." After lunch they had another walk, but a much pleasanter one, for in the first place the sun came out, and in the second Darwin took them all to a gallery, where, according to him, there was an ancient, remarkably alert echo. Stamp your foot, and it would bounce off a distant wall like a rubber ball. Darwin stamped, but no echo turned up, and he said that some American must have bought it for this house in Massachusetts. They strolled over to Martha's room, and soon Archibald Moon arrived, and Sonia asked Darwin softly why the professor's nose was powdered. Moon started to speak with his mellow Russian, flaunting rare and rich proverbs. The girl's conduct, thought Martin, was decidedly reprehensible. She would sit with stone-like countenance and laugh for no reason at all, as her eyes met Darwin's. The latter sat with crossed legs, tamping the tobacco in his pipe. "I wonder why Vadim hasn't shown up yet," said Martin uneasily, and tossed the teapot's full cheek. "Oh, go ahead and pour," said Sonia, whereupon Martin busied himself with the teacups. They all grew silent, watching him. Moon smoked a tan-tinted cigarette belonging to the kind referred to as Russian in English. "Does your mother write to you often?" asked Miss Silanov. "Every week," answered Martin. "She must miss you," said Miss Silanov, and blew on her tea. "Well, I don't see the national lemon," Moon suddenly observed, in Russian again. Darwin, lowering his voice, asked Sonia to translate. Moon gave him a sidelong glance, and switched to English, deliberately and maliciously imitating the average Cambridge manner. He said that there had been some rain, but that it had been cleared, and most likely would not rain any more. He mentioned boat races and gave a detailed version of the well-known joke about the student, the closet, and the girl cousin. Darwin kept smoking and murmuring, "Very good, sir, very good. That's your authentic, sober Briton at the moments of leisure." "17. A pounding of feet came from the stairs. The door flew open and Vadim appeared. Simultaneously, his bicycle, which had left in the lane with one pedal lowered and propped against the edge of the sidewalk, trembled with a jingling noise, which easily reached the low second story. Vadim's small hands had bitten nails, and were red from holding the handlebars in the cold. His face, suffused with an extraordinary, delicate, and uniform rosiness, bore an expression of dazed confusion, which he tried to conceal by panting as if he were out of breath and making stifling sound with his nose, which was habitually humid outside. He had on wrinkled pale gray flannel trousers, an excellently tailored brown jacket, and an old pair of pumps he wore at all times and in all kinds of weather. Still sniffling and smiling a bewildered smile, he said hello to everybody and sat down beside Barwin, whom he liked very much and for some reason called Mamka, wet nurse. But him had one inevitable jingle, with a limerick arrangement of Russian rhymes. "Приятно зрать, когда большой медведь подводит под ручку маленькую сучку, что ее poet. What fun to stare where the great big bear walks home arm in arm with a tiny dog to lay her there." His rapid staccato manner of speaking was accompanied by all kinds of hissing, trumpeting, and squeaking sounds like the speech of a child start short both of ideas and words of incapable of keeping still. When embarrassed, he would grow even more disjointed and absurd, and would seem like a cross between a shy, tongue-tied adult and a whimsical infant. Otherwise, there was a nice, chummy, attractive fellow, always ready for a laugh and capable of subtle perception. Once, at a much later date, out of row on the river, which Martin one spring evening, when a chance breath of air brought a vague odor of myrtle from heaven knows where, Vadim said, "Smells like Crimea," which was perfectly true. He was a great hit with the English people. His college tutor, a fat, asthmatic old man, specialist in mollusks, pronounced his name with guttural tenderness and treated his perfect idleness with perfect indulgence. One dark night, Martin and Darwin helped Vadim take the sign off a tobacco shop, and that sign graced his room ever since. Vadim also procured a police helmet by means of a simple but ingenious trick for half-a-crown that he flashed in the moonlight. He asked for a good-natured bobby to help him climb over the wall, and once on top he leaned down and snatched the helmet off the man's head. He was also the instigator in the episode of the fiery chariot. It happened during the Guy Fawkes Day celebration. The entire city was spewing fireworks. A bonfire burned in the square, and Vadim and his pals harnessed themselves to an old landau acquired for the couple of pounds, filled with straw, and set it on fire. Dragging this landau, they spread through the streets, nearly burning down the town hall. On top of everything, he was a master of foul language, one of those who became attached to a ditty and to repeat it endlessly, and are fond of comfortable mother-oriented oaths, corrosive physiological terms, and fragments of obscene poetry attributed to Lermontov. His education was undistinguished, his English very droll and endearing, but barely intelligible. He had a passion for the navy, for mid-layers, for the beauty of dreadnoughts in battle array. He could play for hours with toy soldiers firing peas from a silver cannon. His quips, his pumps, his shyness, mischievousness, his delicate profile, with its outline of golden bloom, all this combined with the splendor of his princely title, had an irresistible heady effect on Archibald Moon. Somewhat like champagne of salted almonds, he relished formerly, a lone, pale Englishman in a misted pince-nez listening to Moscow gypsies. At present, however, Moon sat by the fire with a cup in his hand, munching a muffin and listening to Miss Silanov, who was telling him about the Russian newspaper her husband planned to start in Paris. Martin, meanwhile, reflected with alarm that it had been a mistake to invite Vadim, who sat silent and embarrassed by Sonia, and furtively kept shooting raisins borrowed from the cake at Darwin. Sonia had grown silent too, and sat gazing pensively at the paniola. With an easy swing, Darwin walked over to the fireplace, knocked the ashes out of his pipe, and turning back to the flames, began warming himself. "Mamka," Vadim mouthed softly and chuckled. Miss Silanov kept speaking excitedly of matters that did not interest Moon in the slightest. It grew dark outside, and somewhere far off newsboys were shouting, "Pai Pa, Pai Pa."